Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 56th audio file in the audio cast series known as the Q News Patriot. I am the Q News Patriot. My name is SG Anon. It's been a little while since we've come together. I hope that's all right with all of you. It's been an absolutely incredible last couple of weeks, has it not? We have watched the narrative warfare space continuing to expand, continuing to sledgehammer the consciousness on these very real issues: child trafficking, biological terrorism, government weaponization of everything imaginable. And the vast majority of the population, for the first time, is really starting to pay attention now to the more salacious topics, the topics that are unpleasant on their face, unpleasant at the thought, unpleasant at the mental creation of them within our own mind, right? And so that is one of the things that triggers the reactive MK Ultra fear program defense complex that we know as MK Ultra mind control. The fact that we are starting to see a very large portion of these individuals out there across all political divides seeing things like child trafficking, human trafficking, gun running, smuggling, whistleblower retaliation, governmental retaliation against citizens at a vast, large level. The events happening right now within Canada, for example, the events happening in Ireland, the events that have happened in Sweden recently, events happening in Finland and in other areas of the world, right? We're sort of highlighting, and we've been very, I think, delicate in this process, but very effective at highlighting just who in different key areas of our societies is on our side and who is not. We have a pretty large amount of information, that I'd like to cover today on our file, and not a lot of time to do it in. I'm sure many of you are tired of hearing me say that these days. I'm kind of tired of hearing me say it, to be perfectly honest. Things have been quite busy, and things have been, in some respects, quite sad. We've been dealing with a loss on this end. It was unexpected. Good chance that that's connected to the war that we're all living through, right? Had an expansion in day jobs. Of course, we discussed that a few weeks back, day job responsibilities, and that's been a continuing balancing act. And things with my personal life and my kiddo and making sure that he's cared for and provided for. It's a very challenging dynamic to have, but it's one that I'm quite pleased, and I consider myself extremely blessed to have, despite the difficulties, despite the unpleasantries. Despite the unpleasantries, there we go. Take a breath. And despite the losses. So as we go through our file today, we have a lot to cover. We're going to cover operations in China and Russia. We're going to cover Ukraine a little bit. We're going to cover Africa, different nations around the world, specifically the continent of Africa as it pertains to food and food security and resource security for this next phase. We're going to talk about President Trump. And we're going to talk about infiltration. I shouldn't say within our own ranks, but infiltration or controlled opposition on both sides of the aisle, and how that, I believe, is next, based on research, to be highlighted and shown out really obviously to the people. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right to it. Recently, we saw, as a matter of fact, I believe it was today, I'm just dropping today in the early morning hours, the reports of a massive fire at a Buddhist temple in China. This fire sort of took everyone, took the attention of everyone, right? It was very close in Notre Dame, and as far as format and parallels, right? The Notre Dame fire of 2018. It is in an area of China in northwest China called the Gansu province. This is a Belt and Road area. The Belt and Road Initiative slated to go through this area of the world. There's a corridor of large Buddhist temples in that area of the world, and it's worth also noting that Gansu and this area that we're discussing right now is less than a day's drive from the Three Gorges Dam and from Wuhan, China. So when we saw this report of the fire coming up, I thought it was absolutely fascinating that we should have a fire at a Buddhist temple in a relatively innocuous, sort of unknown area of the world, right? And we know that this Luciferian cabal at the highest levels has infiltrated many of our institutions and our religious and divinity lenses institutions, and has affected them in some form or another, be it using their infrastructure to carry out their agenda, utilizing their space to carry out rituals, things of this nature. The Notre Dame Cathedral parallel and other parallels to that in Europe, for example, is a good example of hidden trafficking ways, networks connecting these very large, very old churches and cathedral systems. That's the same all over the world in many regards. And the Buddhists God love them, are certainly no different, and they've been taken advantage of in the same way that we all have here in the West. So when we look at what happened here, I thought to myself, well, it's very strange that we should have this sort of a fire and that it was extinguished so quickly. It almost seems like a look here, not there discussion. So I got digging into Gansu in this particular area, and what I found was absolutely startling and very eye-opening. So I went online and I looked for a number of things that I could tie back to significance within the Gansu province of China. So on the cue boards back in the day and in different areas around the internet, it was discussed that China's People's Liberation Army was building silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles in the Gansu Desert, which is in this area, in a major expansion of Beijing's nuclear capabilities. So it's an area that is militarily significant, right? We have these ICBM silos, more than 100 of them believed to be captured on satellite images, being built at a rapid pace. This was in 2021 in China. Another interesting thing about Gansu province, China, has a lot of thorium deposits, and North Korea also has massive amounts of thorium and other rare earth minerals, right? So you're talking about the capability to research and refine minerals and processes within extracting minerals from the earth and creating something like nuclear warheads or nuclear capable reactors with things like thorium and this ilk, right? These radioactive elements. And Gansu, China is extremely resource rich in that. So we would have, this sort of fits a pattern, right? When we're talking about, and we're talking in generalizations right now, but we'll get to the nitty gritty specifics in just a moment. Generally, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. We know that the cabal, the deep state mafia, has a vested and keen interest in anything that offers high power weaponry capability, anything that offers the capability to capture, control, and then dispense large amounts of energy, whether that be for military or civilian profiteering purposes. They have an interest in maintaining a very strong military presence and power around things which they consider to be extremely important. Just look at Area 51, different top secret bases in and around the world, in the US and around the world. You look at the resources that are typically very close to or even on these bases, and then you consider the amount of security, the amount of deterrence, the amount of presence that militaries around the world place in these arenas. These are critical, important arenas, right? And so part of this process is getting to the critical and important arenas, disempowering the weapons of mass destruction, if any are there, disempowering the ability to create extremely powerful, deadly, conventional, rogue, dirty bombs, cutting off the espionage assets, access to the equipment necessary to destabilize and cause chaos in regions, right? That has to occur in this silent war that we're all living through. If it does not, then we might as well just all go home at this point. There's no point in continuing this process if we don't mitigate and then remove, in that order, large threats to humankind. So I went online after finding those particular generalizations and thinking to myself, well, this looks like it could be connected to something that's a little bit more important. Let's see what we find here. And I went and I searched Gansu on the deep web, and I found connections to the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. Gansu Enterprises, Gansu Mining Company Barbados Limited, Gansu Yinhe Foods Group Limited, and Gansu Wenshan Metallurgy Chemicals Company Limited. All included in these papers. I didn't get into all of them for our file today. All the information behind what I just described here would be enough for a singular file all on its own, and it may very well be. Excuse me. So I thought this was interesting that we had a connection to Barbados in this process. The jurisdiction of Gansu Mining Company Barbados Limited, for example, is limited to Barbados and is linked to Barbados. And yet Gansu Mining Company Barbados Limited is owned wholly, 100% equitable interest. Let me make sure I said that correctly. Bear with me just a moment. 100% equity interest attributable to a group called China. Let me see here. China Gold International Resources Corporation, later renamed China National Gold Group. And I've pulled up what I found here in my research was an accountant filing from November of 2010. And we have this group, the China International Gold Group, as having 100% equitable holdings in the Pacific PGM, which is a mining group, Inc. that is incorporated in the British Virgin Islands, the Pacific PGM Barbados Incorporation, which is incorporated in Barbados and was incorporated in 2007, the former being incorporated in 2001, just a few months actually before 9/11. The Gansu Mining Company Barbados Limited, also incorporated in Barbados on September the 7th, 2007. It's worth noting that Gansu Mining Company Barbados Limited and Pacific PGM Barbados Incorporated, these two separate mining companies, both of whom are listed as holding companies by principal activity, were incorporated 24 hours apart. We also have Gansu Pacific Mining Company Limited. That's a Pacific mining-based company, and that was incorporated in Gansu province in China a year before, September 18 of 2006. And the group only maintained a 71% interest holding in that group. Yunnan Southern Copper Barbados was also incorporated in Barbados on September the 7th of 2007, the exact same day the Gansu Mining Company Barbados Limited was incorporated, and yet it was trashed not even 3 years later on May 25th of 2010, also incorporated as a holding company. So when we consider what we have here, what are mining companies typically used for in this process? Let's use a little bit of vertical extrapolative logic and consider what these organizations are doing. Why are we incorporating Chinese mining companies halfway around the world in Barbados, 24 hours apart from one another? Why were two of them incorporated on the same day and one was dispensed with 2.5 years later? These are questions that should be asked, right? How does this tie back to the Chinese command and control economy at home? How does this tie back to the Belt and Road, what has been, traditionally based off of the Silk Road from the days of old, right? And we know that the Silk Road and different corridors through the Eurasian steppes and through central and western China have been used for drug trafficking, organ trafficking, biological trafficking of pathogens, of tissue samples, of persons, of corpses, cadavers. All of these sorts of things have gone through these dark outlets on these trade routes that get shipped all over the world, right? That's how the organized child trafficking is one of the ways that the organized child trafficking at the deep level, the human medical trafficking experimentation complex, which consists of satanic ritual abuse, torture and murder, torture for research sake, medical experimentation, the likes of which we just don't have time or a stomach today to get into on this particular file, right? And so when I look at this and I consider what's happening at this temple today, July the 26th of 2023 in China, it's probably happened over the last 24 hours. And we have significant connection with this province in northwestern China, which also happens to be home to China's 3 largest Buddhist temples, the main attractions, right? These are the equivalent of the Basilica in the West, or the Sistine Chapel from Michelangelo, or the Notre Dame Cathedral, right? Or the Catedrales Gótica in Spain. Okay, these are very large attractions. These are holy sites. These are very old holy sites. I believe they're about 1,500 years old, actually, in the present day. And so this is the perfect area. And if we're continuing with the pattern, it would hold to reason that we would have some sort of human trafficking corridor going through here, some sort of organ trafficking corridor going through here. And if you were a special operations group needing to obtain access and actually launch a strike to eliminate such a network, to eliminate such a cell in this area of the world, one of the greatest things I think that could be done is a distractive event, a fire, some sort of weather event or weather phenomenon. We've witnessed these operations carried out under the guise of just driving rain, flooding, the likes of which hasn't been seen in certain areas of the world ever, or in several hundred years. How many times have you heard that headline, right, in the last 2 to 3 years? Some sort of weather event that was unprecedented, not seen in generations, maybe ever, right? And so these sorts of tactics, this screams counterintelligence and irregular warfare to me. This screams special operations. And I think it's extremely reasonable if we look at the track record here, if we look at the track of what we find in the province of Gansu, that child trafficking and human trafficking could have been targets of a white hat special military operation. And it gets a little bit deeper even with this Gansu mining company. So let's go over here. Where is it at? Give me just a moment. I want to pull this up. All right. So China's Belt and Road Initiative in the global trade. You can find this on OECD.org. This didn't even have to come off of the deep web. It was just difficult to find. China's Belt and Road Initiative in the global trade, investment, and finance landscape. It's an overview of the Belt and Road Initiative and what it stands for. And it's worth noting that the OECD group has been in on a lot of this nefariousness for a long time. As a matter of fact, the company we were just discussing a moment ago, China Gold International Resources Limited, I believe was the name of it. Let me be sure. I want to get that right for you all. Yes, China Gold International Resources Corp Limited. That group was actually investigated by the Canadian government in 2014 for what the Canadian government believed to be egregious human rights violations that were not commensurate with doing business in Canada. And of course, this company being incorporated in British Columbia and being subject to the rules of the Toronto Stock Exchange. That's of course one of the conditions, right, is you have to meet the Canadian government's assertions of what appropriate business representation and behavior and conduct around the world really is. And so it's worth noting that we already have a questionable history. Of course, everything in China sort of does if you're in the West, right? The clarity of information is difficult unless you go really deep on it and you do a lot of really good studying. But, I think we have all sort of heard along in this process that these organizations which claim to be human rights and humanitarian supportive oftentimes are not, and many times the ones that are conducting the most egregious of the evil, the shipping container transfers, the cargo transfers and shipments, the actual child slave labor. Mines are one of the number one locations in the world for underage slave labor because you can get so much out of that youthful energy. And so it's applied in a very egregious and disgusting way. So when we look at companies like this having already been investigated for human rights abuses and misrepresentation of themselves from a humanitarian viewpoint, it paints that picture, I think, a little bit more. But coming over here in this document, it discusses this company, Gansu Mining Barbados Limited, and it states that which is an investment firm of the China Three Gorges Corporation, or an investment arm, of China Three Gorges Corporation. So the Three Gorges Corporation is financially interested in this mining company and in a couple of other mining companies from this area of the world, all of whom happen to go back to the same area where these three large Buddhist temples reside in the northwestern Gansu province of China, where we know the Chinese military has a massive presence for nuclear and high power weaponry capability. At the very least, they're building decoy silos there. And they also have a vested interest in the radioactive power and energy components of the earth in this region, right? We know that Notre Dame was built in such a way as to capture that radioactivity and that electromagnetism from the earth and concentrate it in a useful energetic form. Does it not stand to reason that in addition to being the temples that they are there within China, and this is just speculation, but does it not stand to reason that we could have a similar component occurring here? We could have similar sensitivity here. And so this deep state, black hat, Five Eyes, mercenary, deep military intelligence, whatever you want to call it, this mafia would have a vested interest in this area of the world. Considering the association with the mining and the human and drug and gun trafficking component that could also be present here, many of them going back to the Caribbean, the Barbados, one of those companies we discussed. Let me go over here. Gansu Limited is incorporated and jurisdicted in the Bahamas. Gansu Yinhe Foods Group Corporation Limited is jurisdicted in British Anguilla, and is also linked to Hong Kong. Gansu Winshin Metallurgy Chemical Company, jurisdicted in Samoa, also linked to Hong Kong. We have Gansu Enterprises Limited in the British Virgin Islands and linked to the United Arab Emirates. So when we consider what's actually occurring below the surface. When we follow the money, when we look at the financial entanglements, that unravels this entire hydra. The problem is it is such an arduous and large task to do so. There is so much to comb through. These individuals have spent the better part of 5 centuries building an illegible web, a spider web that you could never find the beginning and the end, right? And so why would you even bother? It's one of their securities. It's one of the ways that they guard and guarantee themselves the continuation of power, right? The only people that are ever going to take the time to appreciate the connections and actually bring them forward, right, in their minds, were they themselves, and how wrong they were. The digital army will stop at nothing to bring these to bring this information out and fully connect these dots. But it is absolutely amazing when we consider the scale, the vastness, the scope of this web of evil all around the world, right? These companies financially inform one another. A couple of the companies we were just discussing directly owned by a large Chinese state-based gold and resources group that is incorporated in British Columbia, Canada, right? And does business on the Toronto Stock Exchange as well as with Citigroup Asia, because that's on the account document that I was just describing to you a moment ago. So it does not come as a surprise to me after we look at the context and we appreciate what's occurring here, the fact that we're experiencing strange fires, odd events in this area of the world. It is also not surprising to me that this fire and that these events would come less than 48 hours after a Chinese government official, Qin Gang, was removed from the party calendar, the party roster, and he's not been seen in public for more than 3 weeks at this point. We know that President Xi, after the coup of last year, has used his loyalists and the patriots within the Chinese military and military intelligence community to identify traitors at the domestic level and take them out in the same silent espionage, surgical warfare approach that's being used all around the rest of the world. When you're trying to prevent the other side from pulling the fire alarm, so to speak, and letting everyone know that the fox is in the hen house, you go through the building and you take them out covertly one by one. Eventually, you wind up with a sort of a die-hard Bruce Willis movie style situation where it's only 1 or 2 people left. And by then it's too late. They're outgunned, they're outmatched, they're outnumbered, whatever, right? And so that is the process that we're fighting this war right now. We are going through and removing saboteurs, traitors, internal threats from our systems. We're purging our processes before we move on to next phases. And President Trump tells us we're coming into next phases. These sorts of operations are being carried out by the FSB right now within Russia. There's been several government officials and local level officials that have been detained for, quote, questioning with regards to the Wagner rebellion, which we know wasn't really a rebellion, but it was perhaps one of the greatest fifth generational warfare chess moves that we might have ever seen in real time, understanding fully what's happening here. The Wagner Group is relocated to a strategically desirable position, sort of like the difference between a 6-ounce sirloin and a filet mignon. We have Belarus now has been given the clout and the military personnel and equipment necessary to guarantee their security. And that was absolutely one of Lukashenko's concerns with President Putin, was that the CIA, and particularly the CIA operatives in Poland and the Baltic states, would attempt to stage a color revolution and destabilize his country. And now we have the Wagner Group, more than 30,000 of them, very battle hardened, very well trained, very well equipped, very current on irregular warfare tactics, very current on the sort of guerrilla warfare that's been going on in that area of the world being used by the cabal, and they are now there to help secure and protect the Belarusian countryside. I also believe that they will be used at some point in this process, based on the trends that I'm seeing, as an offensive force yet again, but not until the defensive positions and defensive areas have been shored up more fully, and I think more to the liking and security of the Belarusian state. We're witnessing incredible events popping off all around the world. I know that things are tough out there, right? We just had gasoline go up in this area another 37 cents overnight. We know that OPEC is cutting oil supply, but that's actually a good thing. We're choking off the United States serpent dollar. We're choking off the defunct U.S. corporate government. We're choking off the ability of the Satanist economy here within North America and around the world to continue industry, to continue production, right? Oil is needed for weapons of war. Oil is needed for manufacturing and heavy industry. And excuse me. mineral refinement and things of these natures, right? Oil is needed for production in general, economically and industrially, and we're not able to do that with the less oil that we might have. And so as we look at this process, even though it is unpleasant, we are clearly, and I think resoundingly, winning. We are advancing in all significant corridors. Just this week, we had a statement from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that FaceTime between the Russian government and African nations would be occurring very soon to ensure that those African nations have enough food that they can rely on from Russia and from Russia alone, where they can feed their populations. And so what do we have from that? We have a disconnection from the Western economy happening in real time. We have a disconnection of what's occurring, of those feeder arms that feed back into corporations like Nestle and Kraft Heinz and other extremely large food giants that are transnational located in the Western nations. We're disconnecting them from the African continent. We have been here in the NATO Khazarian West, even though all of us were not aware of this. Our governments have been bleeding the populations and the people, villages and towns and cities in the African continent absolutely dry to the point of death for hundreds of years at this point. All right. It's been a very unfair situation. It's been colossally wrong. To call it a war crime doesn't even do it justice. We're talking about hundreds of years of pilfering and pillaging and destitution. We're talking about hundreds of years of forced labor, of theft of your children, theft of everything important to you, theft of ancestral lands, right? No different than what we did here in the United States in the 19th century under the Kabbalist governments that forced all of the natives off of their lands, right? The exact same process, but on a much grander scale. And Russia and China are taking steps, China in particular militarily, taking steps now to offer guarantees and to offer solutions and another way of doing things in a fair and just manner. And it's worth noting that none of the African nations from the we the people level, right, would trust anything to come from the United States, whether it was President Trump delivering that message or whether it was others delivering that message, because we have generationally demonstrated that we don't care about their interests, right? And so it had to come from another equally capable, equally powerful player in this process, which is Russia. Russia has the manufacturing, the agrarian, the industrial, and the energy capabilities to meet such a demand, and they are discussing that actively with the African continent right now. It's absolutely incredible when we consider the vastness of this scale and the vastness of what we're living through. Give me a second here. I'm going to go over my notes, make sure that we've discussed everything, or that we've discussed a lot of these things. All right. So we do have evidence of search and destroy operations happening in these nations over the last 2 to 3 weeks. Russia and China, we already talked about. We're also seeing that evidence in the United States of America. Different individuals being arrested, or excuse me, not arrested, resigning for personal reasons, for no comments, for conflicts of interest. We've seen some indictments issued at low-level localities and state levels for things like election interference, fraudulent vote harvesting, ballot harvesting. These operations are continuing, right? It takes a while. When you consider the size of the mule network needed to carry out the heist that was carried out in 2020, which I believe was spawned off by the alliance in an effort to force everyone else out of the woodwork. And I think it was very successful in doing that. But the scale and the scope of that particular mule network is enormous. And so we are continuing in those, I think, to the greatest extent possible. Hunter Biden, for example, being another individual in the legal space, we'll move on, to him. We'll move on to these other nations in just a moment. But let's talk a little bit about Hunter. Hunter is a very unique, I think, part to play in all of this. He had access to Joe's bank accounts. He had access to Chinese financial records. He had access to business deals at the state and nation level. He had access to elbow rubbing with essentially anyone who is anyone within the deep state complex, but he was younger than a lot of them. If we look at the age groups for the controllers, right, he was sort of being primed to be just like his daddy, primed to be just like what Joe had established himself as within the deep state mafia all around the world. Very high ranking, very well, very well used and useful in that political, useful puppeteering and idiot space, right? And those individuals in government and in finance and in different areas of power and control publicly around the world, as we know, are about 3 to 5 tiers from the very top of the pyramid. But they do have sort of some hierarchy and some prioritization within and of themselves, right? The Clintons, the Bush family, the Biden family, they're very high up in this at a political level all around the world. And so Hunter has now been in court several different times. He's been ordered by U.S. courts to produce certain documents, certain records. His sweetheart deal that we were all very upset about, and I think a lot of people were very upset about just a few weeks ago, which served its purpose, and it highlighted the absolute ridiculousness of the two-tier level of justice, the two-tier justice system itself. It has now gone away. And it has gone away. Why? Because the Foreign Agent Registration Act, in other words, acting on behalf of a foreign government, acting on behalf of a foreign government is now back in play with Hunter. The judge removed that deal based on the current sort of out to pasture issues with this FARA violation. And Q references FARA. I believe it's drop 3950. And in that drop, it discusses Pelosi's son, Biden's son, who would be Hunter, Romney's son. It discusses Ukraine. It discusses the connections with the energy market, right? And so we're talking about someone who has a lot of extremely good information, not only about the worldwide deep state, but about the traitors and the roaches here at home and how they carry out the things that they carry out. How do they get to the parties? How do they get the messages from other Luciferian members at the very top? How do they get paid? Where does it come from? Who has control of them? Was it voluntary or not voluntary? You can get a lot of this information from someone like Hunter. And so what happened today as Hunter showed up at the courthouse, we saw him show up in a motorcade. We saw him show up in what appeared to be a law enforcement escort style motorcade that had multiple cars with it. Everyone very prim, very clean, very polished, the antithesis of everything Hunter Biden, right? You would expect this guy to show up in a Chevy Geo and a crack pipe hanging out of his mouth, but that's not what happened. He showed up in this almost like, head of state or first son style motorcade, right? And that has not happened with him publicly before, not to my knowledge. And I haven't, admittedly, I've not investigated it very deeply, but I've not seen anything quite with the pomp that we saw today with Hunter. And so what does that tell me? This is just a supposition, but I think it's possible that we have Hunter who's now willing to talk about all of the foreign agents, all of the foreign interests that were involved with him, that he was involved with, maybe not to his choosing, right? Maybe some of this he ended up in by mistake. Maybe some of this he ended up in because he was being brought up in this system, right? We really don't know. We have incredible evidence, obviously, to show online the extent of the Biden corruption, the extent of the Hunter corruption, the extent of how promiscuous and sort of awful this person is, right? A pedophile, all of these other things. But now we see him today in this high power escort going into the courthouse. Something has changed. And so when we consider that search and destroy operations are becoming more public, they're going and they're starting to become more obvious with the things that are occurring and the weirdness behind some of the takedowns, resignations, and legal cases that are being filed and brought out. I think it's very telling. We just recently had a Scottish minister or a Scottish deputy minister that was arrested. And I believe that minister or deputy minister was participative in the previous government for that area. And I don't remember if it was local or state. I don't think it was federal. I think it was local, but I could be wrong on that. But I read the article discussing that this former Scottish minister or deputy minister had been apprehended, and that investigations were ongoing, right? It was in reference to an ongoing investigation. I read another article recently discussing the RCMP investigating Trudeau and his violation of Canadian civil rights. Now, if you're a Canadian listening to this broadcast, the first thing you say is, oh yeah, that's like the FBI investigating the Bidens. And while that is true, and while there are absolutely traitor assets, especially at the very top in controlled power levers in these organizations and these 3-letter agencies and 4-letter agencies like the RCMP, like the FBI, like Interpol, like other, state-based police and law enforcement organizations, excuse me, there are also patriots within these organizations. Remember, the same FBI that's currently being shown out by Christopher Wray as being what it is, a nothing more than a secret state police in everything but name here in the United States of America, acting on behalf of the Democrat National Convention and the Democratic Party. This same FBI at one time, patriots within this organization at one time were investigating the worldwide international financial fraud of the Clinton Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative. The Financial Crimes Division was very deep in that process. As a matter of fact, they were so deep in that process that a whistleblower with knowledge of the matter went online anonymously in the same forum as Q and began discussing relevant particulars without identifying information of what was happening, and essentially that the corruption was so deep and the hole was so massive and so wide that the team that was doing the investigation was outright overwhelmed and were not sure that the information would ever see the light of day because of what it implicated and because of what it appeared to show. It showed all of the money laundering from the 2014 Haitian, or excuse me, from the 2010 to 2014 Haitian incidents with the Clinton Foundation and that global initiative to all around the world, different organizations and foundations and associations, right? Different control of different arenas. It was this sort of money that was used to put people like Laura Silsby, who was apprehended in Haiti for attempting to kidnap more than 30 children. It was this money and other money like it that allowed for this individual to be removed from Haiti, expatriated, brought back to the United States, and that individual got a high-level executive job at a company that issues Amber Alerts. So when we consider the financial clout and the web of finance and the web of patriot versus non-patriot and the web of shipping that goes into this and shipping lanes and supply chains and the web of military industrial technology that we have to identify and deal with, it makes a lot of sense why it does take this long. But I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic, but I'm extremely optimistic today because we had a pretty powerful indication from President Trump that this is phase 2, that Kim is in play, that we are headed towards phase 2, or headed into phase 2, and that phase 2 could be quite rough. Give me just a moment here. Let me pull this up. All right, here we have it. A truth from the Commander-in-Chief on TruthSocial. Truthed at, let's see here, 9:18 EST. We'll have fun on the stand with all of these people that say the presidential election wasn't rigged and stolen. Stolen spelled wrong. Stolen spelled with 2 L's to pronounce as Stalin. Wasn't rigged and Stalin. In capitals, the trial of the century, 3 exclamation points. I think he's describing, of course, what we're all waiting to see, right? The military tribunals, the trials of the century, what actually comes out publicly in that process. I'm extremely excited about that. I'm sure all of you are as well. But the breakdown on this truth is what gets me even more excited. If we come over here, and it's a relatively simple breakdown. If we come over here to Q post 918, posted March 10th, 2018 at 2:05 and 58 p.m., we have an Anon that shared a tweet from Trump. The tweet posted 10 March 2018 at 1:38 p.m. North Korea has not conducted a missile test since November 28, 2017, 1 month to the day exactly after Q went live on the boards, it's worth noting, and has promised not to do so through our meetings. I believe they will honor that commitment. Q responds, "You are learning. How many coincidences before it becomes mathematically impossible? Wait until you learn who has been talking to you here." So that tweet, of course, or excuse me, that Q drop, of course, referencing North Korea, referencing Kim, the excuse me, the conduct of the Kim government in North Korea with POTUS in power. And what was amazing to me is if we reverse the timestamp to 819 instead of 918, we have post 819 from February 23 of 2018, posted at 6:54 and 10 seconds p.m. Eastern Standard Time. There are a couple of graphics in the post. The graphics are, stay tuned, everything has meaning or a purpose. At Jack, getting nervous, phase 2. That was a Q post from February 21 of 2018. Contained within the graphic below that graphic picture, Trump warns, this is a status, it looks like, from a Twitter account. Trump warns world of very, very unfortunate phase 2 if North Korean sanctions fail. That was put out on 23rd of February, 2018. So it's worth noting that the Trump tweet we just referenced in our previous drop 918, occurred just a couple of weeks after this, about 2 weeks after this tweet out discussing a very, very unfortunate phase 2. And the Anon posting these graphics puts phase 2, no coincidences, question mark, as attempting to ask for some confirmation from Q, and Q responds, no coincidences, expand your thinking. So in both instances here, we have Trump highlighting North Korea. We've been talking about North Korea being a key player in the nuclear scare, some sort of nuclear false flag style event, whether it's an event or a narrative, for a while now. Trump has talked about Kim with his big red button and how they're friends. These things have been discussed publicly and openly. We're sort of not hiding it. And with Trump coming out with a very powerful draw to North Korea, election treason, nuclear treason, I think, when we're discussing crime, trial of the century, right? All of these different things, I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's certainly very encouraging to me to look at that and say, is he highlighting that we're at a next phase in this process of military operations? Doesn't it make longitudinal sense and chronological sense as well? Russia is now defining their next phases for this operation in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe. I believe a massive Russian offensive is actually planned for either August or September. We'll wait and see and see what comes of that. But there's been information circulating in different press and alternate citizen journalism outlets online discussing a lot of preparation, a lot of military movement, a lot of personnel and manpower movement, a lot of housing camps and barracks camps being built in different areas along the Ukrainian front and in the countryside there, all along, the western borders of Russia and in Belarus and in Eastern Europe in general. So, or that theater, excuse me, in general. So when we look at what's happening here, it coincides very perfectly with what could be happening within the United States. We've talked about the continuity of government operation moving to next phases. That began a few weeks back, right? We're seeing evidence of that. We've seen evidence of that. Just recently, Mr. DeSantis, in a car accident in Tennessee, I believe it was, or on his way to an event in Tennessee. No one sustained any injuries necessarily, but it just seemed odd, right? It just seemed out of place. We had a sort of three fender benders right there, as this individual who has clearly demonstrated disloyalty and who Trump has clearly referred to as being a very disloyal man. I just find that very fascinating, and the timing even more so. When we look at what's being drawn out in the House Oversight Committee hearings today regarding UFOs and aliens and the non-biologics that have been obtained by the U.S. government. All right, we have military-grade intelligence whistleblowers here discussing that they have possession of and access to hardcore physical proof that the U.S. government knows aliens are real, knows that non-terrestrial, other humanoid life forms are real. They've been concealing that information from the general public for a very long time, and one has to wonder why. And I think we're going to see a very fascinating rabbit trail explored on that arena as well. So when we look at these operations to this point in the context of a very broad, very vast, irregular war that is being waged all around the world in key areas, narrative seeding, consciousness seeding, event drives, event-driven happenings, right? Those are a component of all of this. This is, I think, part of a much broader, greater plan to provide awakening, to provide fuel to the awakening fire, is a better way to say it, for everyone out there, regardless of what is important to you. Everyone is passionate about something. That's one of the reasons it's had to be done this way, because as we have seen the things that we're passionate about offended, railed against, attacked, maligned, silenced, censored, made somehow irrelevant, even though we all know that they're not. Everyone else is experiencing some version of that as well. The cat's out of the bag and everyone's watching it tear up the carpet. And so now, as we go through and we isolate the true problem children, if you will, the true issues, the true saboteurs that are in all areas, right? As we drain the NATO warfare industrial complex, as we destroy the human and dark organ trafficking operations that are occurring all around the world, right? As we eliminate the networks between nation states that are used to move such cargo and nefarious equipment and possessions around, we are driving forward with, I think, a fervor that's really difficult to describe, and it's creating such a wellspring of excitement on our side of that consciousness war, and it's creating such a very large, vast caldera of terror on the other side. And that's what this is all about, right? For the first time ever, they don't have full control. For the first time ever, their excuse me, their honey holes and their playgrounds and their sandboxes are no longer safe. For the first time ever, we have access to all of their books. For the first time ever, we know who's been doing what with who in the dark. We know what's been occurring behind closed doors. We know what room 29 at Epstein Island is. We know there are many other islands like Epstein Island and far worse. We know this, right? And we're going to find it. And that's a nightmare scenario for them, and they hate it. And so what we have watched unfolding at the narrative space, at the surface level, between what is clear weather warfare being waged by one or both sides, with, and that's in relation to the destruction of the Pfizer pharmaceutical plant in North Carolina, right? It didn't even damage the parking lot. The tornado descended directly on the facility. We look at what's happening in the skies and in the climate areas of large U.S. metro areas and other large metro areas around the world. When we look at the wildfires happening in Sicily and in Canada, and in, I believe it was Palermo, Sicily, and in different areas, right? When we look at what's occurring, the wildfires in Greece, the election interference in Greece, it is a clear back and forth war, and we are winning because they are so destabilized and they are so desperate that at this point, it doesn't matter what they do. So they're doing whatever they have to do. And that's sort of been the entire point all along. If we get them to do things how they really want to do them, we can track and trace every single individual, every single component in that war machine, every single component in that mercenary complex that is weaponized against mankind, and we can end it once and for all. And that's why we're here. So today, folks, I leave you overjoyed. I leave you so enthusiastic that it appears we've knocked out yet another organ and human trafficking corridor or junction. I'm so enthused that we are continuing these operations in Europe, and the African continent is now being given a chance at true independence from the Commonwealth realms. Excuse me. I am elated to discuss all of the different cybersecurity infiltrations that we've been experiencing and watching, even though they are negatively affecting some of our own systems, right? We're using Luciferian systems. If you own an Apple smartphone or a Google Android phone or any variation of that technology, you're using a Luciferian biometric surveillance system. And those systems are being attacked by good actors. And for the first time, those attacks are successful at large corporate, at large nation state, governmental, transnational corporate levels. And that's a beautiful thing. I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your week. I hope you enjoy your weekend to the greatest extent possible. I plan on trying to monitor things a little bit more closely. I will make an attempt to be back with you sooner rather than later. I do want to make a quick apology for my incorrectness on file 55 regarding Durban, South Africa. I had trusted a family member in asking questions about the geography and the geolocation of that area of the world rather than looking it up myself. Learned my lesson there. But I will endeavor to be back with each of you again in a more prompt and punctual way. There are simply so many things happening that are for the good. We didn't even talk much about the changes in the financial sector, the SEC implications with the XRP lawsuit, different things happening around the world right now, right? We didn't even get into those things today, and yet those could also be whole files in and of themselves. You have a plethora of information to draw hope from. You have a myriad of choices and an incredible variety of encouraging, empowering information, but it's important to approach that information with the correct lens. You can't just read the headline, right? You have to go through and do a little bit of digging and appreciate what's actually occurring. And what's actually occurring is triumph and victory in a very arduous, very deadly, and very silent war for the control and destiny of mankind. We are fighting for our children. We're fighting for our children's children and their children and their children beyond that. We're fighting to have a say in our communities, in our provincial and municipal and locality areas. We're fighting to have a say in our state institutions and in our national institutions and in our history and in writing the correct history, right? We're fighting for humanity. And I'm so glad to be fighting alongside all of you. This is SG Anon, everyone. I'll be back with you again soon. Stay safe. Thanks. Bye-bye.